Here we are with American Miscellany, once again, reading some essays from this beautiful book published in 1865. Here we have the lovely plate that goes with our essay for today. It's titled Camels Loading, Preparatory to Starting. And here we go, we have another plate of Oriental Mode of Travel. Right, so our essay today is called Travels in the Holy Land, number 1. Our previous essay, essay number 12, was about the extent of the United States. We are now moving in essay 13 to the Holy Land. This was published again in 1865, American Miscellany, page 40. Essay number 13, Travels in the Holy Land, number 1, by Harriet Martineau. It was on Sunday, March 28th, that we were to enter the Holy Land. I had been too much engrossed by the objects which interested us at every step in Egypt and Arabia to think much of this beforehand, but when I came forth from our tents in the dawn of the morning, there was enough novelty in the scene around me to make me feel that we were about to enter upon a new country and a new set of interests, and I became eager to know at which hour we were to pass the boundary which separated the desert from the Holy Land, the home of the old faith from that of the new. We had followed the track of Moses from the spot where his mother placed his bulrush cradle to that on which he died. For to the east we should this morning see the mountains overhanging the Dead Sea, and among them the summit of Nebo, whence he looked abroad over the land of promise. And now we were to enter upon the country of Jesus, certain to walk in his very footsteps and to see what he saw, perhaps this very day. I never remember feeling such an interest in every wild flower, in the outlines of all the hills, and the track of all the watercourses. We had left the stony desert behind us and were encamped in a nook of the hills where the ground was green and weeds grew thick. There was grass under my bed in the tent, and when I came out in the morning, the dew was heavy on the daisies and buttercups and flowering mallows which grew abundantly on the turf. After breakfast, while the camels were loading, I walked in the early sunshine on a strip of sand overlooking the valley, impressing on my memory every feature of the landscape and impatient of the rising ground to the north, which prevented my seeing where we were going. It was about 10 o'clock when we passed the boundary. It was impossible to tell the exact moment, but within a mile or two we felt that we were indeed in the native land of Christ, and probably on his very track. He might have been here. His relations lived at Hebron, and during the first 30 years of his life he had probably visited them, after meeting them at the feasts of Jerusalem. He might have walked over the hills which swelled higher and higher as we advanced, and rested beside some of the wells which yawned beside our track. At any rate, the trees and flowers which we saw must have been familiar to his eyes, the thorny acacia which began here to rise and spread from the stunted shrub of the desert to the dimensions of a tree, the scarlet anemone, with us a precious garden flower, which here strewed the ground for acres round, the cyclamen, which pushed forth its tufts of white and lilac blossoms from under many a stone and bush, and the poppy, mallow, hemlock, and wild oats, which grew as thickly as in any English hedge. I did not know before that these weeds were as common here as with us, and never before did the sight of them give me so much pleasure. It would have been pleasant anywhere to meet these familiar weeds so far from home, but the delight today was to think that he and his disciples were as much accustomed to them as ourselves, and that a walk in the early spring was, in the pure country, much the same thing to them as to us. But we soon came upon traces which showed that the expanse of pure country here was small in those days, compared with what it is now. The towns must have been more thickly set here than in any country I ever was in. Patches and masses of ruins showed themselves on every hand, so near each other as to indicate the land must have been peopled to a degree now nowhere known. The first plowing we had seen for many weeks was a striking sight to us, a mere scratching of the soil at the foot of the hills, but close by lay a heap of building stones, the remains of a town or village. Presently we saw a rude plow with a single camel at work, and at hand was a long foundation wall laid in a far distant century. On a height further in were the remains of a large ancient building with 2 broken pillars standing, marking the site of the Aurora of Scripture. Then, though there were many watercourses about every hill, wells began to abound, substantial, deep wells built with a rim with holes in it to receive the covering stones, such wells as tell of a settlement beside them. We stopped early this day, partly because it was a Sunday, and partly because of our Arab guards, who know nothing of our Sunday, found a convenient place among the hills, somewhat sheltered from the cold wind. And here, a very few miles from the boundary, the gentlemen of the party discovered that we had set down in the midst of what was once a large town, though the place appeared a mere stony tract, like many that we had passed. In the morning, early, I went out to see for myself, and was astonished at the extent of the ruins, which I should not have observed while merely riding by. I could trace the lines of foundation walls for half a mile, and building stones, overgrown with grass, lay in hillocks for a considerable distance round. The many caverns in the limestone rocks, now used as beds for the goats, were found to be the vaults of large buildings now gone to ruin. In a few minutes we traced 3 temples, or other such buildings, by their overgrown pillars. Let's see if we can get a nice close-up here. We can't. And here we have a print of Hebron, a little engraving of Hebron. Our eyes being now opened, we this day saw more and more remains, till we were convinced that all the way from the boundary to Hebron, the land was thick set with towns and swarming with inhabitants in the days of its glory, the days when the teacher went up and down in it, meditating the changes which must make it what I have seen it now. Its hills and streams, its skies and flowers are today what they were before his eyes. But where he saw towns on every height and villages in every nook, there is now hardly left one stone upon another. A group of black Bedouin tents on a hillside, a camel or 2 browsing here, and a flock of goats there, are all that relieve the utter solitude where there was then an innumerable throng of men. As we advanced on the Monday, the soil became richer, and field was joined to field, so that we began to look for the landmarks which are here used instead of fences to bound field property. We entered upon thickets and shrubberies, where white roses, the cyclamen convolvulus, and fragrant herbs abounded. Soon after noon, a new scene opened upon us. On our left hand lay a wide, deep basin among the hills, full of vineyards and olive grounds, where the stones from the soil were built up into fences, and in almost every plot rose a garden house. This was a sure sign that we were near a town, and as we rounded the hill on our right, we came in sight of the 2 entrances on which Hebron was built. There stood the town where John the Baptist was born, and here were the scenes which he must many a time have talked of with his cousin in their boyish meetings at Jerusalem for the feasts. Hebron, too, is only 20 miles from Bethlehem and only 26 from Jerusalem. And in those days, when a large amount of yearly traveling was a solemn religious day was a solemn religious duty incumbent upon every family, it is scarcely possible but that relatives must have often visited each other, and that Jesus and his parents must have come to Hebron. The cave of Machpelah is there, and the burial place of Abraham and his family was a sacred locality and an object of pilgrimage to Jews of all ages. As we inquired for it and walked round the enclosure, which the Mohammedans now permit no Christian to enter, I could not but think who might have been before, as in the same quest. As I sat on a tomb in the Turkish cemetery the next morning, watching the preparations for our departure, I almost dreaded the interest which every day would now bring, after the calm and quiet weeks we had spent in the desert. Our encampment looked much the same as it had done every morning for a month past. The Arab servants busy in taking down and packing the tents, and a noisy quarrel going on in the midst this morning about a pistol having been stolen from one of the tents. And the differences were only that there were spectators standing by, and that our camels had given place to horses and asses. But instead of the rocks and sands of the desert, Hebron was before my eyes, and the hills where Abraham spread his flocks, and the spot where he and his family lay buried. And before night, I should see the place where David was born, and lived his shepherd life, and where Jesus was born. We had only 20 miles to travel this day to Bethlehem, but it was quite enough, for we were eager about every old tree and well and hilltop. The shrubs grew finer, and the wild flowers more abundant. The whole way through the hills of Judah were wild and stony in parts, and no longer fit for pasturing such flocks as covered them when Abraham lived among them, or when the Hebrews drove in their cattle from their desert, or when David in his boyhood amused himself with slinging smooth stones from the brook while his father's sheep were feeding on the slopes. We sat down to rest and eat under the shade of a rock and a spreading tree, and for the 100th time since we left Egypt, it occurred to me how little we can enter into the meaning of David when, in his divine songs, he speaks of the shade of rocks and the beauty of a tree planted by rivers of water, and all such cool images. When one has been slowly pacing on hour after hour over glaring sands or heated rocks under a sun which makes every bit of leather or metal, or even one's outer clothing feel scorching hot and oppressing one's very breathing, the sight of a patch of dark shade is welcome beyond belief. And when one has dismounted and felt the coolness of the rocky wall and of the ground beneath it, and gathered fresh weeds which cluster in its crevices, phrase after phrase of the psalms and prophecies come over one's mind with a life and freshness as sweet as the blossoms in one's lap. Our first sight of Bethlehem was beautiful. Just a picture of Bethlehem. Beautiful. And here we have Jerusalem with its walls. It's a northwest view of Jerusalem with its walls. Our first sight of Bethlehem was beautiful. We came upon it suddenly, just when the yellow sunset light was richest. Bethlehem was on the rising ground on our right, massive-looking, as all the villages of Palestine are, and shadowy. As the last sun rays passed over it to gild the western hills, and another village which there lay high up, embosomed in fig and olive orchards. The valley between, out of which we were rising, lay in shadow. Before us, perched on a lofty ridge which rose between us and Jerusalem, was the convent of St. Elias, which we were to pass tomorrow. I was sorry to turn away from this view, but we had to take the right-hand road and ride through the narrow streets of the village to the great convent built over the spot where Jesus is believed by monks to have been born. It is too late this evening to see any of the sacred localities, but it was quite enough to have the moonlight streaming in during the whole night through the window of my lofty convent chamber, and to think that on this hill took place the greatest event in the history of the world, and that in the fields near, the gentle Ruth went about her gleaning, little dreaming in those days of her poverty, that from her meeting with Boaz among the reapers of his harvests would arise the events to the human race, that the shepherd grandchild whose divine songs were to soothe her old age should be the mighty king he was, and the father of a yet mightier who should build the great temple of the Lord, and that a more distant descendant should make those glories appear as childish toys in the presence of his greater sovereignty over the universal human soul. A wise man of a late century has nobly said that prosperity is the promise of the Old Testament and adversity that of the New. On this hill was born the prosperity of the old dispensation, and on this hill was born the man of sorrows who knew the secret of true peace, and taught it in the saying that it profits not a man to gain the whole world if he loses his own soul. In the morning we went into the church of the convent. I cared little for the upper part, with its chapels for the Greek, Latin, and Armenian worship, and not much more for the caverns underground, where the monks believed that Joseph and Mary remained, while there was no room for them in the inn. If the town was too full to receive them while the people were collected for the census, it is hardly probable that they would repair to an underground cave. But in this cave Mass was going on this morning. Sad striking was the effect. After coming down from the sunshine of the crowded cavern with its yellow lights and their smoke and the echoes of the chanting, we returned when the service was over, and saw the star in the marble floor which marks, as the friars believe, the precise spot where Jesus was born, and the marble slab which is laid in the place of the manger. When I saw throughout the country how the Arabs now use the caves of the hills to bed their goats and cattle, this belief of the friars appeared less absurd than it would with us. But still, it is so improbable that the precise spot of these transactions, whose importance was not known till afterwards, should have been marked and remembered, that I felt little interested in them in comparison with the landscape outside, about whose leading features there could be no mistake. We have a few more engravings here. The first one is convent erected on what tradition affirms to be the cave of the Nativity. That's where our author Harriet stayed the night. And below that we have the tomb of Rachel. From the bottom of the garden, we overlooked the great valley which expanded to the northeast, and one enclosure there, a green spot now marked by olive trees, was pointed out to us as the field where the shepherds were abiding on the night when Christ was born. Behind it, to the east, lay range behind range of hills, stretching off to the north, and among these, we knew, lay the Dead Sea and the Jordan, where it pours its waters into that lifeless and melancholy lake. As we left the convent and village and descended the rocky road with terraced vineyards and olive groves on either hand, we knew that Joseph and Mary must have come by this way from Jerusalem when summoned to the census, and this was more to us than all the sights the friars had shown us in their zeal and kindness. We looked in at the tomb of Rachel, and at the convent of Elias, but our eyes and thoughts were bent towards Jerusalem. I remember, however, that here I first saw the waters of the Dead Sea lying blue in a little gap between the hills. As soon as I had mounted my ass before the convent of Elias, I saw from our ridge some buildings on the rising ground which now showed itself before us. I was not immediately certain what they were, but the news soon spread among us. That rising ground was Zion, and those buildings belonged to Jerusalem, though they stood outside the wall. Immediately after, the walled city itself came into view, lying among the hills. Most of the party were disappointed. I was not, partly because I know that we were approaching it from the least favorable side, and partly because my expectations had much underrated the size and grandeur of the city. What we now saw was a line of white walls on a hillside, with some square buildings and small white domes rising within. I walked the rest of the way. On our right were hills, the summit of one which was Al-Sedima, bought by the priest with the money which the wretched Judas returned to them when he found too late what he had done in his attempt to force his lord to assert his claim to a temporal sovereignty. On our right was the plain of Rephaim. When we arrived at the brow of the high ground we were on, we were taken by surprise by the grandeur of the scene. Zion now appeared worthy of her name and of her place in the hymns of David and in history. We were now overlooking the valley of Gihon, more commonly known by the name of Himnon. From its depth and its precipitous rocks on our side, I should call it a ravine. This deep dell contains the lower pool, now dry, and the aqueduct from Solomon's pools is seen crossing it obliquely. Its opposite side is Zion, rising very steeply, still terraced for tillage in some parts, and crowned by the city wall. To the right, sweeping away from the ravine of Gihon, is the deep and grand valley of Jehoshaphat, clustered with rocks, relieved by trees, and leading the eye round to the slope of Olivet, which, however, is best seen from the other side of the city. The black dome of the tomb of David was the next object, and after that, the most conspicuous roof in the city, the great dome of the Mosque of Omar, which occupies the site of Solomon's temple. By this time there was silence among us. I walked behind our cavalcade as it slowly ascended the beautiful rocky way, glad of the silence permitted by each to all, for it was not possible in the moment, nor will it ever be possible, to speak of the impressions of that hour. We entered by the Jaffa Gate, and every echo of our horses' feet in the narrow, stony, picturesque streets told upon our hearts as we said to ourselves that we were taking up our rest in Jerusalem.